Welcome to the next part of this training, where I'll be covering the descriptions and definitions of things like stimuli, responses, and a three-term contingency. Here's a description of the task list areas that will be covered, as well as the test content outline that will be covered. And I want to start off by saying, I'm sorry, this isn't going to be the most fun presentation, but it's important information that you will need to prepare you for the exam and put you in contact with some of the terminology that you'll probably hear as you work as a RBT. But I also think it's important to say we need to proceed with caution here, because I will be covering a lot of jargon, and it's very important jargon and terminology from a scientific perspective, as well as information that you're going to need to know. But it's definitely information that we probably shouldn't use when we're talking to clients or parents or caregivers. So just a note to proceed with caution with where you're going to use this terminology. It will probably be more used with your supervisors and on the job, but should be avoided, especially with people that are less familiar with our jargon. That could be off-putting. It's similar to when you go see a doctor. Doctors are going to talk to doctors using different language than they're going to talk to you. So make sure that you're using language that's comfortable for the caregivers and parents or the people who you're talking to. So now that that's out of the way, and again, I'm so sorry, this is going to be a tough one to get through, but bear with me. I'll try to make it as fun as words can be. But we're going to start with behavior. That's the basis of what we're talking about here, right? I'm going to go over the technical definition for each of these terms, and then I'm going to go over a more simple language description. So first we have behavior, which is the behavior of an organism is that portion of an organism's interaction with its environment that is characterized by a detectable displacement in space through time of some part of the organism that results in a measurable change in at least one aspect of the environment. Blech, that's a lot, right? Again, it's important that we know these technical definitions, but to really understand the concepts, try to put this in your own language, and I'll provide examples of that. So we have the technical definition of behavior, which is the thing that we're really interested in as behavior analysts, but a more simple language is any movement of an organism through space and time that can be objectively counted. That captures everything that was described in the earlier one with just some more simplified language, and it might be more comfortable using descriptions like this. And again, to prepare yourself to use these terms, it's better to know the concepts than the terms and definitions. So try to come up with your own simple language descriptions for each of these. Next up, we have response. The technical definition of a response is any action of an organism's effector, an effector as in an organ at the end of a different nerve fiber that's specialized for altering the environment mechanically, chemically, or in terms of any other energy changes. Again, that's a lot. An easier, simple language description of a response is just a single instance or occurrence of a specific class or type of behavior. For example, opening a door. Opening a door is a very simple example of a response, and I encourage you to think of what are some single instances or occurrences of a specific class or type of behavior that you could consider a response. So like, again, opening a door. Here's an example of opening a door. Next up, we have a response class. The technical definition of a response class is a group of responses of varying topography, all of which produce the same effect on the environment. And what we mean by topography, and I'll dive into that later, is what the behavior actually looks like. So when you hear topography, think form or look. What does the response look like? If we think about response classes in simple language, it's just different responses that have the same outcome. So if we stick with the opening door example, there's many different ways in which you can open a door, many different ways in which doors can be opened, but they all lead to the door being open. So there's a response class of opening doors. They all lead to the same outcome. A repertoire, specific definition, is it's sometimes used to refer to all the behaviors that a person can do. And more often, repertoire denotes a set or collection of knowledge or skills that a person has learned that are relevant to a particular setting or task. Again, it's a lot, but important to know. A simple language description of repertoire is just all the behaviors a person can do. So if you think about your repertoire of opening doors, it's all the ways in which you can open a door. A repertoire typically refers to all the behaviors a person can do. Behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. Responses don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in the environment. And behavior and behavior analysts and RBTs describe the environment as a full set of physical circumstances in which the organisms exists. It's comprehensive and has many facets of the physical world that may be considered a contribution to behavior. Typically, environment is a specific term for any particular behavior that's the focus, usually on those environmental events that are functionally related to the individual responses. If we make that more simple language, it's everything in the real physical world. Everything that we can see makes your environment. We're most interested in parts of the environment that have an effect on behavior, but the environment is everything that's going on around us, including ourselves. We're part of that environment. Now that we're getting into the three-term contingency, part of the three-term contingency is the stimulus. Technical definition is an energy change that affects an organism through its receptor cells. Applied behavior analysts most often study the effects of stimulus changes that occur outside of the body, not necessarily inside the body, even though those stimulus changes can happen, but we're more interested in stimuli that happen outside of the body. And if we think about a simple language description, it's anything within the environment that can have an effect on a behavior or an organism. For example, here's a baseball player. If I put this up and I ask you what is it, you say baseball player. Well, this stimulus has had an effect on your behavior. A stimulus class differs from a response class in that the technical definition of a stimulus class is any group of stimuli sharing a predetermined set of common elements in one or more of the dimensions of a stimulus or physical event. We can talk about stimulus events formally by like physical features, or temporally, for example, when they happen with respect to the behavior of interest, as well as functionally. And Justin's going to talk much more about functions of behavior, but when we talk functionally, we're talking about a stimulus's effect on behavior. A stimulus class, from a simple language perspective, is anything within the environment that can have an effect on the behavior of an organism. So if we think about this from a simple language perspective, using my previous example, what are these? Baseball players. So this is a stimulus class that is held together by certain predetermined stimuli or predetermined aspects of these different things. Like it might be a hat, it might be a jersey, it might be a bat, but all of these might occasion the response baseball player. So these are held together in terms of a stimulus class. Antecedent, the technical definition is environmental conditions or stimulus changes that exist or occur prior to the behavior of interest. Simple language definition of an antecedent is anything that occurs right before the targeted behavior. So typically these things are related to the behavior. It's not just something that happened to happen before a behavior, but these are typically things that happen right before a behavior that have some type of a relationship with the behavior. A consequence is a stimulus change that follows a behavior of interest. Again, this is a technical language definition, so again, any stimulus change that follows behavior of interest. If we want to think about this in terms of a simple language description, it's anything that occurs right after the target behavior. So antecedent is anything that happened right before the target behavior, and a consequence is anything that happened right after the target behavior. We typically talk about behavior in two classes, and I know Justin had talked about this a little bit as well, but one of which of those classes of behavior that behavior analysts are interested in is respondent behavior. And the technical definition of respondent behavior is behavior that's elicited by antecedent stimuli. Respondent behavior is induced or brought about by a stimulus that precedes the behavior, and nothing else is required for that response to occur. So again, respondent behavior is made to have happen. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the stimulus that induces or makes that behavior happen. So a simple language is unlearned behavior that is useful for survival. So an example of a potential respondent behavior is salivation. I know I talked about Ivan Pavlov and the bell, and his name might ring a bell. So respondent behavior is salivation. Salivation helps us break down food, it helps us eat. If we didn't salivate, it'd be more difficult for us to consume food, be more difficult for us to survive. Another example of respondent behavior that's commonly used is a puff of air in your eye. That makes your pupil constrict or dilate. You don't have to learn that for it to happen. Another example is commonly a hammer on your knee, how it makes your knee or your leg kick up. You don't have to learn that to have it happen, and every time that hammer is hit in the right spot, that behavior happens. So again, it's unlearned behavior that is useful for survival. Now, respondent behavior differs from operant behavior, and that operant behavior is any behavior that's determined primarily because it's history of consequences. And remember, a consequence is something that happens right after the behavior of interest. Operant behavior is selected, shaped, and maintained by the consequences that have followed it in the past. So the difference here is we typically talk about operant behavior as learned behavior. Simple language is operant behavior is behavior that's affected by the consequences that follow it. If I were to puff air into your eye, no matter what happens after I do that, your eye is either going to constrict or it's going to dilate. No matter what the consequences are that follow it, that's going to happen. It's not affected by the consequences. But if I teach you that 2 plus 2 is 4, and that when you say 4, when I say what's 2 plus 2, that leads to something that we would call reinforcement, and it increases the likelihood that you'll say 4 when I ask you what 2 plus 2 is. Now we're talking about operant behavior. That's behavior that's been affected by the consequences that follow it. A lot of the behavior that we engage in is operant behavior, but it's important to note that not all of the behavior that we engage in is operant behavior. And so we have to take into consider respondent and operant behavior if we're going to have a full picture of why people do what they do, and to be able to provide more effective interventions for the people with whom we're privileged to work with. So now that we have all of that out of the way, we can dive into the 3-term contingency, because this is made up of the antecedent behavior and the consequence. And this is the basic unit of analysis in operant behavior. And it encompasses the temporal and possibly dependent relations amongst antecedent stimulus, behavior, and consequence. That's a lot. Let's break it down in simple language. A 3-term contingency is just the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent sets the occasion for the behavior occurs, and some consequence happens that alters the probability of that behavior happening in future similar contexts. Here's an example of the 3-term contingency. So on one column you can see the antecedent stimulus, in another column you can see the behavior, and in the final column you can see consequence. So, for example, name a carnivorous dinosaur. Wow, I'm struggling with that word. The behavior is Tyrannosaurus rex, and the consequence is well done. So the next time I were to ask you that question, you'd be more likely to say Tyrannosaurus rex as opposed to other dinosaurs. And you can see those examples throughout here. Another important component that we consider when we're thinking about the 3-term contingency is motivating operations. A motivating operation is an environmental variable that alters, which means increases or decreases, the reinforcing or punishing effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event. And it alters, increases, or decreases the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced or punished by that stimulus, object, or event in the past. I know that sounds like a lot, so let's break it down into some simple language. A motivating operation, simple language, is something that makes a consequence more or less effective, and behaviors that led to that consequence more or less likely. We tend to talk about motivating operations in 2 different larger aspects. One is an establishing operation. So an establishing operation technically is a motivating operation that increases the effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event as a reinforcer. Simple language is it's something that makes a reinforcer more effective and behaviors that led to that reinforcer more likely. So for example, if you wanted to obtain wine and you didn't have access to wine for a while, that would probably increase the reinforcing effectiveness of wine and increase the likelihood of all behaviors that have led to you accessing wine in the past. So maybe going to the store to buy wine or going to a restaurant to acquire wine. Whatever behaviors you've engaged in the past, if wine serves as a reinforcer for you, if you haven't accessed wine for a while, that means we probably have an establishing operation that increases the reinforcing effectiveness of wine and all behaviors that you've engaged in the past to access wine. Establishing operations differ from abolishing operations, which abolishing operations are a motivating operation that decrease the reinforcing effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event. Now, if we break that down into simple language, it's something that makes a reinforcer less effective and behaviors that have led to the reinforcer less likely. So to stick with my wine example, if you drink a little bit too much wine, it might function as an abolishing operation. So it would decrease the reinforcing effectiveness of wine and would decrease the likelihood of you engaging in any behaviors that you've engaged in the past that have led to wine. Sometimes we would refer to this as getting a hangover, right? So if you get a hangover after drinking wine, you're probably going to want wine less, and you're probably going to engage in behaviors that would lead to wine less frequently. I know this was tough. I tried to make it as quick and painless as possible, although this might have served as an abolishing operation for the rest of the training, but I promise some of the other components of this training are much more fun than just hearing me talk about terms and definitions. But remember, you're going to be quizzed on this. You're going to have to answer questions about this, and you're going to have to know these things to operate in your role as a RBT. So while it's boring, thanks for sticking with me, and it's important to know. Thanks.